I want you to look at this last verse, verse 8 from Psalm 78. And I want you to see the consequences for the choices that you make in this room, the choices that I make. Psalm 78, verse 8 says, "Teach them not to be like their fathers, a stubborn and a rebellious generation, a generation that did not prepare its hearts and whose spirit was not faithful to God." One of the things that probably disturbs me the most about the Bible is this phrase right here. The writer of this psalm is looking straight into the eyes of grandparents, and he's saying, okay, you blew it as a parent. And your children have totally turned their back on God, and they've completely walked away from your faith. And now you have the very difficult responsibility of going to the next generation, going to your children's children and teaching them, whatever you do, don't grow up like your father or like your mother. I failed them, but I'm going to make sure that I don't fail you. And he says, somehow, this godly generation failed their descendants. And as a result, their descendants, their children became a stubborn and a rebellious generation whose hearts were not soft towards God and who were not faithful to God. Did it ever disturb you how one generation, God could lead one generation out of slavery in Egypt, how they could see those miraculous plagues, how they could walk through the Red Sea like it was dry ground. And that same generation, when they were poised with the challenges of crossing into the promised land and taking the land that God had been promising them for 400 years, they would rebel on the very border of the promised land and spend the next 40 years walking in the desert until every single one of them were dead, except for two, Joshua and Caleb. Did it ever disturb you how an entire generation could turn their back and walk away from God? I'll be frank with you for just a second. If you look over the course of American history, the generation that precedes our generation, for the most part, turned their back and they walked away from God. Something happened in the late 40s, the 1950s, the 60s, and the early 70s that caused almost an entire generation of Americans to turn around and to turn their back on God. And now it's the grandparents that are having to pick up the pieces and having to look my generation and your generation in the eyes and say, whatever you do, don't turn out like your father or your mother. And I would say that they would have to admit, because I failed them as a parent, and I don't want to fail you as a grandparent.